welcome Kelly Lynn Mulvey to give her talk today. And Kelly is a associate professor in the Lifespan Development Program in the Department of Psychology of North Carolina State University. And she completed her PhD in the Department of Human Development and Quantitative Methodology at the University of Maryland, and was previously assistant professor in the College of Education at the University of South Carolina. She did her undergrad and master from Duke University, and she was a public school teacher and received certification by the National Board of Professional Teaching Standard. She has federal funding from both the National Institute of Justice and the National Science Foundation. And her research centers on social development in intergroup contexts, with particular attention to creating an inclusive space for children and adolescents. She was particularly interested in bystander intervention to stop bullying, especially bias-based bullying, and creating an inclusive STEM environment for youth. All right, Kelly, the stage is yours.
Thank you all for having me today. So I really see my work as being at the intersection of educational psychology and developmental psychology. And so hopefully I'll try not to use too much developmental jargon and talk more to educationally oriented audiences. But in general, the work that I've been most excited about lately that I've been doing is trying to understand what leads kids to want to pursue STEM interests. And I try to go at it from a lot of different directions. Hang on, let me get my slides going. So broadly, with this big picture question of understanding pathways to STEM careers, I'm trying to pay attention to two big things: social context and what social context factors might matter, as well as group identity. So how do the dimensions of yourself that you bring to any pursuit that you're taking matter for whether you're going to feel successful and feel efficacious in that particular domain? As I think about social context, there's many different factors that matter if you're thinking about interest, motivation, and persistence in STEM. And some of the factors that I pay attention to are things like your own individual identity. We'll talk more about that on the next slide, but your identity can be many, many different facets of who you are. Stereotypes that you may perceive to be present about particular careers or interests that you may have. Social factors, your relationships with others around you and how much you feel like you belong in any particular context. Societal expectations, so the expectations of those around you. That could be your teachers, your parents, your peers, any of those societal expectations that may shape what you decide to do ultimately. Your own feelings of self-efficacy, and then broader other contextual and environmental factors that may come into play. As I think about social context and whether you feel as though STEM is for you, I always come back to questions around group identity. So we know that individuals identify with lots and lots of different groups, and depending on the context that you're in, one or more of those different identities may be salient to you. So as I talked when I first started, I said, I'm kind of at this intersection between developmental and educational psychology. And when I'm talking to a science ed audience, that ed psych piece of me comes out more, and that ed psych identity is more salient. But we can think about how your identities shift and which identities are more salient or less salient depending on the context that you're in. So you could think about identities around your gender, your ethnicity, your school affiliation, your religion, the language that you speak or the first language that you did speak, your nationality, etc. All of these different dimensions of your identity may come into play as you think about who you are and who you need to be in different intergroup contexts. When I'm talking about intergroup contexts, I'm thinking about opportunities for you to interact with people who may be different than you on some of these or all of these dimensions of your identity. And while we'd love for all intergroup contexts to be really harmonious, unfortunately, sometimes these contexts can create tension, hostility, or opportunities for bias to emerge. When you're in an intergroup context and interacting with people who are different than you, then this can also limit opportunities for members who aren't part of that central group. So you may be excluded from an activity or given subtle or even not so subtle messages about whether you fit or are an appropriate choice for whatever that domain is. And intergroup contexts are increasingly common due to the growing diversity of our society. So it's a place where I've been particularly interested in understanding pursuit of STEM interests, because they do feel as though if you don't think that it's a fit for you, then you may shy away from an area where you might otherwise show lots of interest. So today as I talk, I'm going to present 4 different studies, and I tried to pick some that were more experimental, some that were survey-based, some in formal settings, and some in informal settings. So across these 4 talks, the first one is a project that focuses on early childhood and is more about behavior. So we actually had them do an engineering aptitude task in this project. The second one is also early childhood, but it's more about attitude, so your perceptions of who can pursue different career choices. The third one crosses childhood all the way up through adolescence and looks at how educators may shape the perceptions that children who they interact with may have about whether they're interested in a particular STEM domain, and then what stereotypes they may hold about those domains. And then the last one is an adolescent-focused study that looks at the role of feelings of social competency in shaping belonging, and then how feelings of belonging might be associated with later outcomes like efficacy. All right, so to start, this first project on gender and engineering aptitude really focuses in on the color of toys. So there have been these really pervasive stereotypes about STEM and gender that have been around for generations now. And unfortunately, they are leading to disparities, as you all know, in who actually ends up pursuing STEM jobs. So right now, well, not right now, but recently in 2017, women were holding only about 1/4 of the STEM jobs in the United States. We also know that there is a shortage of students entering STEM fields, so there are often more jobs available than there are highly qualified workers to fill those jobs. So one possible reason why women may not be entering STEM fields at higher rates could be the stereotypes that may be present about women and STEM. So even very early on, young children associate boys with STEM careers instead of girls. And we know that boys and younger children are more likely to hold these occupational stereotypes than are girls and older children. So it seems as though things get better over time, but unfortunately those early childhood years are often the foundational years for developing your interests and your thoughts about what you might want to do with yourself when you grow up. So we know that some marketers, especially toy marketers, have been trying to address this early stereotyping that suggests that STEM isn't for girls by throwing lots of marketed items on toys onto the market that use pastel colors and have STEM toys be present. So the goal here is if we color our building materials pink and purple and other pastel colors, then maybe that will attract girls and keep them interested in STEM. So in this project, we were really trying to target this movement towards pastel colors for STEM toys. The Mighty Makers Connect series is a pastel colored series that's made especially for girls. Magnaformers, those magnetic tile blocks, now have an Inspire set that's all pastel colors. And with this, you can build a heart. Tinker Toys are now designed especially for girls and come in pastel colors. And then Lego is ubiquitous now with having both the general pastel Legos as well as a whole series of Lego Friends items where you can build what they perceive to be girl-friendly kind of themes or settings. So there's been this push to create pastel toys, but there isn't that much known about whether these pastel toys are actually leading to changes in girls' interest or their actual ability to build and engineer different creations with these toys. So we know that these stereotypes about color are ingrained really early on, and so it's not surprising that toy marketers have tried to pick up on this in creating toys that might be attractive to girls. Girls receive and boys receive messages about color and gender from the time that they're born. So nurseries are often outfitted in either pastel colors for girls or blue and red for boys, and clothing choices and choices of toys that parents and educators provide are often gendered as well from very early in life. Moreover, there's been a little bit of previous research that suggests that there might be some benefit to using pastel colors with STEM toys. So for instance, there was a study that gave girls opportunities to play with pastel colored toys that are traditionally masculine, like trucks. And the findings of that study documented that assigning pastel colors to these toys actually gave girls implicit permission to play with the toys. So they were more likely to play with them and to start playing with them if they were pastel colored, even if they were counter-stereotypic for girls. So based on this research, we were interested in whether you actually saw differences in ability if girls were assigned to pastel colored versus primary colored toys, and similarly if boys were assigned to pastel or primary colored toys. Now, when I say engineering aptitude, I'll explain in a minute what that looks like. I first want to talk a little bit about the overall method of the study, though. This data was collected in a children's museum, and we aim to work with children who are from about 3 years of age up through 10 years of age. We wanted to get beyond the 8-9 mark because around 8 or 9 years of age, children do begin to show reduced gender stereotypes in general. And so we wanted to make sure that we captured those periods of time when gender stereotypes are especially heightened, as well as cross into that period of time when gender stereotypes may be fading just a little bit. In this study, we did have primarily European American participants, about 75% of them. I appreciate the comment about colorblindness. I have a brother-in-law who's colorblind, and he similarly had a very hard time. He could tell the pastel versus the primary, but he had a very hard time understanding how we would make these decisions about color when marketing toys to kids. Our sample was pretty evenly divided by gender, and we really did try to keep an even gender balance so that we could have both girls and boys who were assigned to pastel and to primary colored materials. I have a little video here, but I'm not sure it's going to work, so we'll see how we do. It wasn't working when I tried it out before. Yeah, see, I've got this terrible can't play media. I will walk you through what the kiddos did, though.
If you wanted to try this, usually,
yeah,
it usually works if you share your screen and have the video playing in a different, not in.
Try that. Let me give it a try. I'm going to stop sharing and I'll try to start the video playing and then share just the video. Let me try it. I'm not succeeding, everyone. You know, I tried the video like right 5 minutes before I linked into the Zoom call and it worked perfectly, and now it just doesn't.
In a separate PowerPoint in a different window on the screen?
Yeah, so I just played it immediately as a regular video, but if you hang on just a sec, I'm just going to save the video itself to my desktop and try to play it immediately from there. Let's see how we do. Thank you all for being patient with me. I can kind of talk you through the, let's see, maybe it'll work. All right, hang on, got it there. Now I just need to get you guys to be able to see it. Give it a try.
Really big ocean, and you got to get this little guy across the ocean without touching it, and you can use anything in this bucket right here. So we're going to use these toys today. Are you okay with that? Okay, so you can use anything in this box right here to build something to get him across the ocean. Can you do that?
There are Legos, there are Kinects, there are the snacks, all sorts of things. Speed through as he builds.
Great job. Okay.
Give me just a moment to get back to the PowerPoint. And then I'll talk you through how we coded and analyzed this data. All right, are you guys seeing the PowerPoint again? Great. Okay, so in general, the kids were given a wide range of materials to build from, and they just had to get that little peg guy from one side of the whiteboard to the other. In many cases, the children needed no help whatsoever, just like the boy who you just saw. but we did code for the number of times that they needed help and the level of help that they needed. So the research assistants began by offering just gestures or verbal prompts. And then if the child was still having trouble starting, then they modeled, this is how you connect the Legos together, or this is how the connects work. And then finally, if the child was still having trouble starting and completing the task, then they provided physical assistance. We wanted to make sure that every child was successful with the task. And so the research assistants would occasionally sit down with the child and really kind of help them through it if that's what was needed. And we counted up or coded for each of those instances of help that was needed. Then we also coded the structures as either simple or elaborate. So the one that you just saw in the video would have been coded as a simple structure. It was a straightforward bridge that was just a single height. More elaborate structures that we saw were some kids built boats, some built airplanes, some built multi-level bridges. They were really creative in their creations that they ended up putting together. So our first question here was to understand whether this engineering aptitude measure that we created differed depending on whether the kids were assigned to the pastel colored materials or the primary colored materials, and if we saw any differences based on the age of the children. Remember, we had 3 to 10-year-olds here. And what we found, first of all, was an age-related difference, that our girls didn't differ, but our younger boys, our 3 to 6-year-old boys, needed much more help in solving the problem and actually accomplishing the task. So if you see here, the low scores are actually higher. So if you showed lower engineering aptitude, you needed more assistance, and so they received a higher score. To understand what was happening with these younger boys who seemed to be needing a lot more assistance, we dug into the questions around the color of the toys that they were assigned. And what we realized was that it was our little boys who were assigned pastel colored materials who really struggled. So they seemed to be very much inhibited by the assignment of the pastel toys and were aberrant from all of the other groups in terms of how much assistance they needed in completing the task. Interestingly, our girls didn't differ at all. It did not matter if they were assigned the pastel toys or the primary toys. They did just as well as the boys in general. And we were not seeing any kind of a lift effect or a boost if they were given those pastel colored toys. Now, it is important to note that in this study, it was just a one-off experience. So they came into the room, it was in a children's museum, and they were randomly assigned to either the pastel or the primary materials. So we didn't really have the opportunity to see whether over time experience with pastel colored STEM materials might actually make more of a difference for girls. But in this one-off experimental design, it seemed as though the pastel materials were not providing a boost to the girls. And if anything, they were actually hindering the performance for those young boys. In addition to completing this engineering aptitude task, we also asked kids to complete a social reasoning task. So we wanted to know, how are they actually thinking about these types of opportunities to play with either pastel or primary colored materials. So we asked them about the acceptability of a counter-stereotypic preference. So we showed them either the primary colored toys for a girl or the pastel colored toys for a boy. This was after they completed the design task. And we asked them how okay or not okay would it be for this girl, Sally, to want to play with the primary materials, or this boy, Mark, to want to play with the pastel colored materials. We used a child-friendly Likert type scale where even the young children could point to a smiley face to tell us how okay or not okay it was. And what we found was that our pattern of results was really replicated with this attitudinal measure. So our older children were saying that it was more okay to play with the pastel, for the girl to play with the pastel colored toys. And when we dug in a little bit more carefully, sorry, did that say for the girl to play with the primary colored toys? I said pastel. It was the girls with the primary colored. And then as we dug into the boys with the pastel colored toys, what we saw was a very similar pattern as to the behavioral task. Our young boys said that it was much less acceptable for a boy to play with the pastel colored materials than did any of our other participants, our older boys or our older or younger girls. So what we're seeing here is a nice convergence between young children's thinking about stereotypes and their actual behavior when they're given the opportunity to engage with materials that may be counter-stereotypic. So the takeaway message here is that in general, we have to be really careful about making decisions about what sorts of materials we provide to kids. It is important to give kids many opportunities to engage with STEM materials, but it may not be the case that just doing something like coding the toys as gender friendly for girls by changing the color of them is immediately going to lead to an increase in engineering aptitude. We may need to think more carefully about increased exposure or opportunities to pair those types of STEM materials that you're providing with messaging around who these toys are for. And we do need to be careful not to forget about the very strong effect that counter-stereotypic materials can have for boys, that it did seem as though these pastel materials were in fact impairing or hindering boys' ability to solve this task. Okay, so moving on, we're going to next talk about, again, early childhood, but in this study, we were interested more in attitudes that might shape young children's ultimate career trajectories. So we know that children often experience social exclusion, and in fact, across the entire lifespan, individuals do experience social exclusion from different situations and observe others being excluded from opportunities. Social exclusion can take lots of different forms. So it could be rejection from a group activity. It could be a denial of an educational opportunity or an occupational opportunity. It could be something like a restricted access to a social support, so something like a healthcare or a special program, or it could be inadequate access to infrastructure. All of these different forms of social exclusion create systemic inequality and lead to different opportunities for different individuals. So in this study, we were interested in understanding whether children are aware of differences in who gets to be different careers, and whether those types of understandings of exclusion from career might actually shape kids' ultimate behaviors down the line. So in this study, it was just cross-sectional and point at kids, how kids were thinking about exclusion from different career opportunities. But the study emerged out of watching kids in early childhood classrooms play in the dramatic play area. And we frequently heard messages from kids saying, you can't be a doctor, you're a girl, or it's not okay for the boy to play at the cooking station, that's not for boys. And so these messages that kids were giving about who can and should engage in what different types of dramatic play really motivated us to understand more carefully what messages kids might be receiving, and then how those messages around exclusion from different types of careers might ultimately shape how they're thinking about career choices for themselves. So we know that even as young as 5 years of age, kids begin to associate different values with traditionally masculine and feminine careers. So they might see traditionally masculine careers as higher status, for instance, than traditionally female career or feminine careers. We also know that stereotypes around intellectual ability kick in early as well. So gender stereotypes associating boys with brilliance are in place by 6 years of age. And we know that children do hold specific occupational stereotypes even in early childhood. So they associate boys with careers like being a doctor or an engineer, and girls with careers like being a librarian or a nurse. The question here was, are these early stereotypes about gender and STEM careers ultimately going to shape the opportunities and interests that kids may have in STEM careers down the line? So we wondered whether young children might condone exclusion from counter-stereotypic career interests. So if a girl expresses an interest in being a doctor, is that something that her peers would support, or would she receive messages that discourage her from ultimately pursuing that counter-stereotypic career? And again, like in the previous study, we were focused not just on understanding counter-stereotypic careers for girls, but also for boys. We do try to always pay attention to both genders in any study that we're focusing on gender for. In this study, we had about close to 150 children. This study was collected in primary schools, so preschools and elementary schools. The children were pretty ethnically diverse and from low to middle income schools. All of the schools were either child development centers or public schools, and it took place in the southeastern United States. In this project, children assessed open-ended questions. They were interviewed by a research assistant, and they heard about children who were peers who were interested in counter-stereotypic careers. So they would see an image of a child and then read, this child wants to be a nurse, someone who takes care of people when they are sick. How okay or not okay is this? We provided them definitions for each of the careers, and half of the participants received Black targets and half of them received white targets. So we were interested here in understanding both perceptions of exclusion from careers that girls might perceive or might have an interest in, as well as boys, and then also differences by race and ethnicity and perceptions of counter-stereotypic careers for white girls and Black girls, and Black boys and white boys. In the measures, children also assess the acceptability of a counter-stereotypic career choice. So this child wants to be a whatever, how okay or not okay is that, and exclusion. What if someone tells her she cannot be a doctor because people like her don't become doctors? We left the language very open and said people like her so that we weren't explicitly communicating messages about gender or race. And then in the study, I'm not going to present the reasoning data in detail, but we did ask children to tell us why as well and coded out their reasons so that we could understand more carefully what was driving their perceptions about if exclusion was acceptable or not. We used very similar Likert type measures as you saw in the last study. And we also sent home a parental survey to the families. So we asked the parents to complete a survey that assessed their attitudes towards STEM. We tried to capture a range of different types of attitudes here. So we had some growth mindset items. We had some expectancy value items about enjoyment and aptitude in math, perceptions of the utility or wastefulness of science and math. And we also asked them to rate how many science and math materials they had in the home. We did end up using this as a composite scale that looked at more positive attitudes towards STEM to less positive attitudes towards STEM, and altogether it was a 14-item measure. Parents were great at filling this out, but it was almost all mothers who ended up filling out the survey. So I call it the parental attitudes towards STEM measure, but it was really the mother's attitudes towards STEM. It was about 95% completed by the female caretaker in the household. Okay, so overall, we see results here for that first measure, which was just the acceptability of the career choice. And then the second measure, which was the acceptability of exclusion from that career choice. So nice finding, as we would hope, they were more accepting of the career choice than they were of exclusion from the career choice. And we did find some differences based on the gender of the children and the age. So in general, our younger children, our 3 to 5-year-olds, were a little bit less willing to accept this counter-stereotypic career choice and a little bit more willing to say that it would be okay if you were excluded from this counter-stereotypic career. I do a lot of work on social exclusion in general, and these ratings that are pretty close to the 3 mark for those young children are actually really high. So you think of this is a 6-point scale, they're saying, you know, it's still below the midpoint, but in general, when we ask kids about if it's okay for someone to be excluded from different contexts, most of the time those measures are hovering around the 1 and 2 point. And so I was actually very surprised at how willing the young children were to say that it might be okay for someone to be excluded from this career. You can see here that we do also have some differences between our younger and older girls and boys, and they kind of model the same pattern there that you see for the overall age-related difference, that in general, for both boys and girls, our older children see it as more acceptable to pursue a counter-stereotypic career and less acceptable to be excluded from that counter-stereotypic career. Now, where things get a little more interesting is looking at these parental attitude measures. So what we find here is that when parents hold higher attitudes or more positive attitudes towards science and math, this was actually helpful for our female participants. When they were assessing the acceptability of a girl pursuing a counter-stereotypic career, so that was either trying to become a doctor or an engineer, the girl participants, female participants whose parents had more positive attitudes were more likely to say that this was acceptable than did the female participants whose parents had less positive attitudes. Now, note here that all of these means are well above the midpoint. And so in general, we're still looking at kids who are saying it's okay to pursue these counter-stereotypic careers, but it is important to note that it is statistically significant that these parental attitudes are mattering, that if your parents hold more positive attitudes, it's encouraging these girls to feel like it's even more okay for them to pursue these traditionally masculine STEM careers. The male line here for our male participants was not significantly different. It was we were only seeing movement for those girls. The parental attitudes seem to be especially important for female participants. And then sort of in concert with the trend that we've been seeing here, we also found an age-related difference for these parental attitudes. Not surprisingly, the parental attitudes mattered more for our younger children and didn't really seem to matter that much for the older children. So as children progressed into middle childhood, they were more independent in their thinking and pretty much said, regardless of what their parental attitudes were, that it would be okay for this girl to pursue a career as a doctor or an engineer. But our younger children, when their parents had high attitudes, more positive attitudes towards science and math, those younger children, our early childhood group, were more likely to say that it was acceptable as compared to our younger children whose parents had lower attitudes supporting science and math. So in general here, we're seeing that parental attitudes do matter, and we're also seeing that over time, these STEM stereotypes can decline. That's not to say, though, that we don't want to pay attention to these STEM stereotypes, because we know that they continue to have an influence, even if they're reduced over time. So overall, we find that younger children are less willing to support counter-stereotypic careers than our older children. And we find that those younger children are also, in concert with that, more likely to condone exclusion from these counter-stereotypic careers. We find that parental attitudes do matter. Our kiddos whose parents had more positive attitudes were more inclusive in general. And we did not document any differences based on race or ethnicity. So I told you that we randomly assigned the kids to either have a Black target or a white target, but not a single race effect came out. Now, there could be two explanations for this. It could be that there are not stereotypes around whether kids of different ethnicities can pursue different types of careers in this age group, or it could be that we didn't have enough power to detect the effects given the fact that these gender stereotypes were so strong that maybe the gender kind of came out on the top and we lost any chance to look at real differences by race or ethnicity. I tend to think, though, that there is really something here to suggest that young children are not perceiving differences in who can or should pursue STEM careers based on whether their peers are Black or white, because of the fact that in all that rich reasoning data that we got, kids almost never talked about the race of the child. They were really focused on gender. They were really focused on things like equity, not okay to exclude someone. Anyone should be able to pursue any career that they want. And we had a category for race and we literally never used it. The kids just were not talking about the race of these targets at all. It was a very subtle manipulation. We did not give them names. We didn't explicitly tell them what the race of these different targets were. It was just an image that they looked at. But I think it suggests some hope here that at least in early childhood and moving into middle childhood, kids may not be developing stereotypes about ethnicity and STEM careers. All right, so we do know that children are holding these stereotypic conceptions about careers as early as 3 years of age in the study. They are becoming increasingly flexible as they get older. So our older children were looking much more equitable in their thinking. And the message here that I would take away would be that teachers and parents should really focus on dispelling these gender stereotypes with very young children. I can tell you for sure that my son, who's now 9, told me that he wanted to be an engineer when he was about 2.5 after going to some science museums and interacting with engineers, and he is still stuck on that career path today. Similarly, my daughter, who turns 12 tomorrow, decided she wanted to be a vet when she was, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4, and she is still stuck on that career as a vet. So these early conceptions of who you want to be when you grow up do many times shape who you ultimately become or what career you ultimately pursue. So if we can work to dispel these gender stereotypes early on, that could have a lasting effect in terms of who ends up having the opportunity and the interest in pursuing these STEM careers. The last message is that we need to be careful about our subtle messaging. So these parental attitudes measures that we captured, they were not parents who were explicitly giving stereotypic messages to their kiddos. It was things like whether they had more STEM materials in their household. It was things like whether they held themselves growth mindset perceptions about who can and should be good at math and science. But these subtle messages can shape children's cognition. So we do need to be careful, not just about the explicit messages that we give kids about what they can and should do, but also about the subtle messages that we may be communicating through our attitudes and understanding. All right, this next project's not out yet. It's in revision right now. But this project looked at the role of educators in informal science learning sites in shaping the perceptions that children from early childhood all the way through adolescence have. This was a really fun project to conduct. We know that gender stereotypes about STEM domains are present across childhood and adolescence, and we know they decline with age. I've shown you some good evidence for that already. But it is the case that boys continue to expect that their group is going to do potentially better than other groups in STEM across childhood or early childhood all the way through adolescence. So this data is a comprehensive study that looked at the change in STEM stereotypes over time from early childhood across adolescence, and there is still a presence of these stereotypes in adolescents. And then adult literature shows that there are still STEM stereotypes, especially math stereotypes, present for adults as well. We know that these gender stereotypes can impact performance. So stereotype threat is a well-established phenomena and documents the role that these stereotypes can have in hindering one's performance or ability. So in this project, we were interested in looking at whether interacting with a female STEM educator might actually be associated with lower gender stereotypes. Now, I have to give a big caveat here because this is another study that was done in an informal science learning site. And so it was just one interaction with a female STEM educator. But we know that some of the research in formal classroom settings does suggest that longer term engagement with counter-stereotypic female role models, so female role models who are STEM teachers in formal school settings, can lead to nice improvements in interest and attitudes towards STEM. But not all kids have the opportunity to interact with a female science teacher or math teacher, for instance. And so we were interested in this project and seeing whether opportunities that are outside of the formal school setting might also have some positive impacts on kids' perceptions of gender stereotypes as well as STEM interests. So we had about 350 or so students in this project. They were more heavily centered on early and late childhood, though we did have a smaller adolescent group in the project. And that's really because of the nature of visitors who come to informal science learning sites. Unfortunately, as kids enter adolescence, they're often less willing to go along with their families to visit these museums, zoos, and aquariums and places like that. And this was just a naturalistic sample of families who came to visit different types of informal science learning sites in the US and then also in the United Kingdom. These sites are all part of a project that we've been working on for a few years now to understand the role of both youth who work in informal learning sites as well as the role of adult educators who work in these sites. And in this project, I'm going to present data that looks at visitors who come through exhibits and have interacted with either a female educator or a male educator at a focal exhibit. By educator, what I'm talking about is a docent who's on the floor, ready to share information with families who come by. And often those educators would have a cart with them with interactive materials that they could engage with. The informal science learning sites that we used included kind of science and engineering museums, children's museums, zoos, and aquarium. In this project, after the children visited the exhibit, then we asked them to tell us how interested they were in math and science. This was just a really quick one-off item for each. And then we also asked them to complete some stereotype awareness items. So we asked who's usually good at math, who's usually good at science, and they could select from either all boys, all girls, or both boys and girls. So if they made the selection of boys, then we considered that to be a male biased response. If they made the selection of girls, we considered that to be a female biased response. And if they said both boys and girls, then we considered that to be an equitable response. A quick heads up before we dig into lots of the findings, we did find quite a number of the visitors did express these equitable responses. So it was often over 50% of participants who were saying, absolutely, both boys and girls can usually be good at science and math. I think that's an important message because it does suggest that we are seeing increasing perceptions of both boys and girls as being good at these different science and math domains. So first I'm going to show you the results for science interest. So not surprisingly, because these were all science informal learning sites, we generally saw a high rate of science interest from all of our participants. And it did not matter whether you interacted with a female educator or a male educator, or whether you were a female or a male participant. So in general, everyone was interested in science, regardless of who they interacted with and regardless of their gender. Where we saw some more interesting differences were in math interest. So here what you're looking at are participant gender by whether they interacted with a male or a female educator. And you can see here that our female visitors who interacted with a female educator, that's our 3.84 bar, were expressing more interest in math than were our female visitors who interacted with a male educator. So there seemed to be a little bit of a lift effect of having this opportunity to interact with a female educator. It's important to note that these female educators were not necessarily talking about math at all. These were broad informal science learning sites, so they may have been talking about the diet of a gorilla, or they may have been talking about how a Cooper Mini works. I'm trying to think of some of the exhibits where we collected the data. The content wasn't specific to math, But we did still see a difference in their expressed math interest, depending on whether they interacted with a female or a male educator. As you can see for the boys, there was actually a tiny bit of a boost effect as well, that the boys who interacted with a male educator were slightly more likely to express math interest than the boys who interacted with a female educator. But in general, the boys were slightly higher in their mean rate of math interest than were girls as well. When we move on to stereotypes, I'm only going to show you findings for math because like the the science interest findings, we didn't find any differences in stereotypes for science. But we did find that our female participants who interacted with a female educator were much less likely to express those male biased responses than were our female participants who interacted with a male educator. So you can see that top line, the solid line, there's a significant difference between our female participants in terms of whether they express these male bias stereotypes, depending on if they worked with a female or a male educator. The male line is not significant here. So for the male participants, it didn't matter if they interacted with a male or a female educator. The findings here are really surprising because this is just a one-off experience and it's often a very short duration experience. So in general, these interactions with the educators were maybe 4 or 5 minutes max, and many of them were even shorter than that. But we do still see that individual children's perceptions can be shaped by even these brief interactions with informal science educators who may be counter-stereotypic. So in general, what we find here is that our female participants were reporting greater interest in math following an interaction with a female educator compared to when they interacted with a male educator. We're also finding that our female participants who interacted with a female educator were less likely to report those male biased math stereotypes. We have no idea whether this would be a lasting effect, whether we'd see if we followed up with them 2 or 3 weeks later, or even 2 or 3 months later, if we'd see this continued declining or lower rates of stereotyping. Our hope is that we would, and in the long run, we would love to be able to follow informal science learning site visitors over time. But our attempts to do that so far have had very, very low retention. If you send out a follow-up survey to these families and ask them to tell us about your stereotypes later on, we were getting under 10% retention response rates, even with incentives. So we have to keep working at how to follow visitors to informal sites longitudinally. Right now, we know that in the moment, there is a reduction in stereotypes if you have interacted with a female educator and you are female yourself. We, not surprisingly, found that science interest really did not differ as a function of educator gender. And again, we think that this is probably because those families who were visiting these informal science learning sites were there because of an interest in science. So we also know that in general, math stereotypes tend to be stronger, math gender stereotypes, than do science gender stereotypes. So for instance, even the rates of girls who pursue biology degrees right now, in many colleges and universities across the United States at least, the majority of undergraduate enrolled students in biology majors are actually female now and not male. So we're not that surprised that we're not seeing this for science, but we are kind of surprised that we saw such effects for math, given that the content of the exhibits really wasn't specifically focused on math. So we think that the important takeaways here are that diversity and representation are not only important in formal educational settings. It may be the case that you don't have the opportunity to have a science teacher or a math teacher, engineering or technology teacher who looks like you in your formal classroom setting. But there are many opportunities to experience educators or STEM professionals who are counter-stereotypic outside of that formal classroom setting. And in the Zoom world that we're in now, I've been thinking increasingly about how even kids who live in rural areas might have the opportunity to interact over a Zoom call, for instance, with a STEM professional who doesn't look like the traditional white male STEM professional, and how that might shape stereotypes and perceptions about whether they could also pursue these different STEM careers. We do think that informal science learning sites should be careful about thinking about who could be delivering educational material on their gallery floors. So if they have the opportunity to create a more ethnically and gender diverse body of docents on the floor, that could be beneficial for these visitors who are coming through. In general, we found for female visitors, ISLs are representing an opportunity to interact. ISL stands for Informal Science Learning Site. I don't think I said that since the very beginning. They are representing an opportunity to interact with female STEM experts who might be providing not only a buffer against the male bias status quo, but also might actually encourage their math interest. We would love to follow this over time and see whether increased opportunities are actually leading to more long-standing changes in both interest and in stereotypes. And then we are hoping that this finding will begin to increase recognition that STEM experiences outside of the formal classroom setting might not be relevant only for learning, but also for challenging these traditional male-biased ideas about ability or interest. Okay, our last project is going to look at adolescents only, and this is the very beginning data from a longitudinal study of adolescents who were involved in informal learning programs in science museums and aquaria. Broadly, one of our interests in this project is whether interacting with and being engaged with peers who are interested in STEM like you are in out-of-school settings can foster self-efficacy. We know that there are many different ways to foster feelings of competence and self-efficacy in STEM domains. Formal school opportunities are certainly a great opportunity for fostering that efficacy, but out-of-school settings are important as well. And kids who have the opportunity to engage in out-of-school programming around STEM may have especially unique opportunities to gain a perception of themselves as efficacious in these STEM domains. So we know that informal STEM learning can promote interest and engagement with STEM, but little is known about the mechanisms. So in this study, we were hoping to unpack a little bit more carefully what factors beyond just STEM content might make a difference for encouraging kids to feel efficacious about science and math. So we looked at social factors. We wondered whether social factors explain increased self-efficacy and competence for adolescents who were involved in informal STEM learning programs. I want to tell you a little bit about the social factors that we were interested in. So I started the talk with attention to STEM identity, and STEM identity can kind of develop as you begin to increasingly identify yourself as a scientist, and that does predict both STEM academic and career orientation. So STEM identity can be really helpful. It's hard to measure, but it can be helpful in shaping your academic and your career orientations. We also know that having a greater sense of yourself as a scientist or a STEM practitioner or a student is associated with greater belonging and motivation for female STEM undergraduate majors. Further, we know that belonging matters in lots of different ways. So feelings of belonging in formal school settings have consistently been linked to greater academic outcomes as well as more beneficial psychosocial outcomes. But very little work has looked at identity and belonging in informal program settings. So this project is looking at the first two waves of what will ultimately be, we're on wave 4 right now, though their experiences are really different because of COVID. So I have to put an asterisk next to the wave 4 kiddos. But we've been working with groups of teenagers who are engaged in long-term informal learning programs. So by long-term, they're committing to at least a year of being involved in these programs. And the programs are all slightly different in terms of their orientations and their structures, but they're housed at museums, zoos, and aquaria in the United States and in the United Kingdom. There are 3 sites in the US and 3 sites in the United Kingdom. We've been beginning longitudinal tracking of these teenagers, but we haven't yet gotten to the point. We actually should, at this last data point that we just collected in December, I think we're finally ready where we could begin to do longitudinal analyses, but we needed the prior control before we could do that. So in this data, we're looking at just cross-sectional data. So as they've been in the programs for about 6 months or so, what are their experiences and how do these social factors matter? Our group of teenagers is pretty diverse in terms of their ethnicity, but they are more heavily female than male. So we have 179 girls and about 89 boys. We're adding more cohorts as we go, but we tend to still see a general split of about 60-40 in terms of gender of the kiddos who join these programs. We're not recruiting the teens, they're being recruited out at the sites. We're just kind of tracking them as they enter these programs and move through them. The kids range in age, they're all adolescents, but depending on the program that they're in, they could start as young as 12 years of age. Most of the programs are more typically starting the kids at about 14 to 16 years of age. And we try to have a pretty even balance between our United States group and our United Kingdom group. In the US, the kids are located at an aquarium, a zoo, and a children's museum that has a heavy STEM focus. And in the United Kingdom, they're located at a really cool biomedical museum that's hung over a functioning cell biology lab, a kind of traditional science and technology engineering museum, and then a medical history museum focused on Florence Nightingale. So the data that I'm going to show you today is about 6 months or so into their program, but it is all collected at the same time point. So after they've had a chance to get to know each other and after they've had a chance to engage with the program to some degree. All of the programs involve both knowledge about STEM careers and STEM domains. So they are learning STEM content, but they also involve training these kids to be on the floor as youth educators or docents in some way. So they are getting some amount of education around interpersonal skills. So how do you engage with the public? How do you talk to others? How do you have that kind of forward-facing presence as someone who's knowledgeable about STEM? And so in this study, we surveyed the kids, again, after they'd been in the program for just a little while, and we did want to capture their social competence. So we asked them questions about how competent they felt in interacting with others. These items included things like, I make friends easily. We asked about how much they felt like they fit with their STEM program, so they're belonging in their STEM program right now. And then we asked a number of different questions to capture the kind of science and math outcomes for these kids. So their science and math self-efficacy and their science and math interest. In general, we wanted to assess whether social competence mattered because these programs are unique in trying to encourage kids' interpersonal skills and not just share that science content knowledge. And so because this is a cross-sectional study, we're looking here at correlations for the variables that are just all at the same time point, but you can see here that the variables are very closely interrelated. So our next task with this data was to try to conduct a path analysis to look at whether social competence mattered for belonging and then whether belonging mattered for these efficacy and interest outcomes. Our correlations suggested we would be on the right path if we tried this. So first we documented that yes, social competency was associated with increased feelings of belonging in your STEM program. And then we documented that those kids who felt like they belonged more in their STEM program reported higher math interest, science efficacy, and math efficacy. So though this is all cross-sectional right now, our hope is that over time, now that we can look at the longitudinal data, that we'll be able to document that increases in social competence lead to increases in feelings of belonging, and that leads to increases over time in feelings of efficacy and math and science interest. And then at the very distal end that you can't see quite right yet is we are going to continue tracking these kids as they exit high school and hopefully enter STEM majors in college or the STEM workforce immediately. And our ultimate goal is to be able to understand whether their participation in these programs was leading them to be more persistent in these STEM domains ultimately. So what we're documenting are positive relations between social competency and belonging, and then between belonging and math and science efficacy and interest. We also saw a positive indirect effect of social competency on efficacy and interest via belonging. So belonging really does seem to matter here. These findings are suggesting the importance of considering social dynamics when developing STEM programs, especially in informal settings, that it's worth your time to spend time fostering interpersonal skills and encouraging kids to learn to get along with others. This is especially important given our global world today, where in order to be successful in any career, but including STEM careers, you've got to have those teamwork skills, those abilities to have positive interpersonal relationships with others. So what we're finding in general is that stereotypes about STEM are emerging early, that they may be especially strong for really young children, that these stereotypes can shape expectations, interests, and behaviors, and that social factors can help to counter some of these stereotypes and create inclusive spaces for teens, not for teens only, for kids in general. I was thinking just about this last study. It's nice to provide kids with opportunities to interact with non-stereotypic educators. We would like to continue following this longitudinally, but at least one-off experiences with non-stereotypic educators was associated with some really nice changes in stereotypes or differences in stereotypes and interest. And we would also encourage inclusive STEM spaces to work on fostering feelings of social competence and belonging. Finally, we would encourage programs that are both in school, formal school settings, as well as out of school to work on building STEM efficacy and interest over time. All right, so this work is with lots and lots of different collaborators, and the primary funding for the projects that I presented here is National Science Foundation, but the UK part of the data collection for those last two projects was funded by the Wellcome Trust and the ESRC. We have lots of different informal learning partners, and then I want to thank my grad students, postdocs, and undergrad research assistants. And I'd love to answer questions.
now.
Just made my screen big so I can see you all. Any questions or thoughts?
Oh, yeah, I've got lots of questions, but I'm going to see if anybody else has questions.
I have a question. In that activity where the first activity where the boy was making a way to get the thing across the ocean without touching it, and there were the two bins, and he seemed to choose, all the pink and magenta and white. Yeah. So were there mixed colors of toys in each bin, or was one bin particular set of colors and the other was, the pinks, pastels, etc.?
That's a great question. So when we were pilot testing this project, we started first, we just wanted to see whether kids would gravitate towards the stereotypic colors. And so we started first with a mixed bin that had pastel and primary. And we worked with the Child Development Center at the University of South Carolina, where I was working then, and basically just went into the classrooms, gave these kids the bins and looked at what they pulled out to use. And it was absolutely the case that the girls were choosing the pastel materials more commonly and the boys were choosing the primary. So that led us to decide, we need to be a little bit more systematic here if we're actually going to be able to conduct this study, because we need to see some boys with pastel materials and girls with primary materials. So we just randomly assigned them. The two bins were present there because we didn't want to make it so obvious that we were like switching out the materials between the kids, because it was in this children's museum setting. So kids were coming in and out. And just as they came in, the next child was just assigned to the alternate color materials. So the experimenter would close the lid on one bin and say, these are the materials you're going to use as the next child was coming into the room.
So he had the option of whatever colors he wanted in that one bin.
Yeah, but they were all pastel. So white, purple, pink, and there were baby blue ones as well. No, actually, I think we pulled the baby blue ones. I think we decided they might mix things up because they were still blue. I think some of the materials came with baby blue and we pulled those out and just did pink, purple, and white.
Interesting, thank
you. So for the very young boys who got the less strong scores, who were assigned the pastels, do you think that the issue was that they felt like they shouldn't be using them, or is it that they didn't know what to do with them?
So we think it was that they felt like they shouldn't be using them because the materials themselves were the same in the primary and the pastel bins. And so the young boys who were assigned the primary had no problem knowing how to use the materials. They were quite comfortable linking the Legos together or using the connects. We saw this greater hesitancy on the part of the boys who got assigned the pastel materials. We coded for, or tried to, but we didn't have a lot of it. We tried to code to see whether any of the kids explicitly were going to say, I'm not doing this. I'm not going to continue the activity. And we didn't find any boys who literally refused to do it or girls who literally refused to do it. We thought we might see that, but it did seem that they were slower to start and needed more encouragement. And that probably is a perception that, I don't know if this is okay for me to be using these pastel colored materials.
I was actually curious about that because those toys are specifically marketed for girls, right? Like,
yep.
So I wonder kind of how that we're implicitly saying also that the other ones aren't for girls by saying these are yours for girls, like, and how that plays it into their beliefs around using the toys.
I think it absolutely does. So when we saw those more explicit attitudinal measures, we saw just the same pattern that the boys were saying, I'm not sure, the young boys were saying, I'm not sure it's okay for my young male peers to play with these pastel materials. So they are getting these implicit messages and maybe sometimes even explicit messages from parents, from peers, and from teachers about what toys are okay for one group of children to play with versus for another group of children to play with.
I wonder if you had data on the participants in that study, whether or not they had like regularly played with Legos of a specific.
Such a good question. We about halfway through the data collection, we had this epiphany and said, oh, we should have included a parent measure and found out what kinds of materials were in the house, but we didn't do it. I think it would have been a great covariate to include there, and maybe some of those more gender equitable households where kids had opportunities to play with both male and female oriented toys, we wouldn't have seen the same patterns. Unfortunately, we didn't think of it.
Yeah, I wonder if like boys having girl siblings.
Mhm.
You know, if the girl toys are just all over the house, you know, I have one of each, and you know, my son would just play with whatever was around.
Whatever's around.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was a missed
I-
opportunity.
Okay, I have a few comments. Is my microphone working okay?
Yes.
Okay. Um, first, I would suggest that at least for the that in your models you might include the colorblindness effect for the boys. They might not have been able to tell a difference between the two sets, and so
You're absolutely
a
right.
simple colorblindness test would only take like 5 seconds, and
Or we
you
could have
could-
just asked the parents as well, and used it
Yeah.
as a control. And as I said,
But
I have
parents
a brother-in-law
often
who's
don't know.
colorblind.
They
That's true.
often
They might
don't
not know, especially in early childhood.
Yeah.
They may not know. It's a great point.
The second thing is that I remember we did a small study that wasn't published looking at sort of engineering stories and whether there was a difference between having a male protagonist or a female protagonist in the story, and whether there was a difference in interest among boys and girls. And
What'd you guys find?
we found that the girls didn't seem to care whether it was a male or female protagonist, but the boys had a real preference for a male protagonist in the stories that they were reading.
That's so interesting. I think the Goldilocks set does come with storybooks that come along with it. When they originally came out, I don't know if they still do. My daughter's gotten too old for them, and my son never had an interest in them, probably because of gender stereotypes.
Yeah, I'm sure Cindy remembers that project. The last thing is that I'm very familiar with the data over the last several decades for incoming freshman interest in careers and awarded bachelor's degrees. And there's been some change in fields like, as you're saying, in the life sciences. But in engineering, totally flat.
Yep.
None of the interventions or ideas that people have tried have any observable effect nationally. And in computer science, we've mainly seen that the percentage of females has gone down over the last 2 decades. So I wondered, this isn't specific to your particular studies, but how could it be that we've had national attention on these problems for the last 2 decades and that it's essentially had no impact? Is it because people are doing the wrong things? Are they thinking of it in the wrong way? Or is it an intractable issue?
I hope it's not an intractable issue. I do think some of it probably comes down to those differences between math stereotypes and science stereotypes, and the fact that the math stereotypes do seem to kick in early and stay present longer. And those domains where we are still seeing really, really large disparities between male and female enrollment do tend to rely more on math. I think if we're looking at things like high school class enrollment, math enrollment, kids who are not taking those advanced math classes or don't have the opportunity to do things like the Project Lead the Way classes. Project Lead the Way, that's what it's called, right? The engineering classes. They don't take those opportunities while they're still pre-college, then they may be boxed out of those majors when they enter college.
Yeah, although in mathematics, I mean, in pre-college level, girls get higher grades than boys in mathematics. So, and I think calculus, at least taking calculus, it's in parity now between boys and girls in high school. So there have been these changes, but they haven't resulted in what a lot of people want as far as more female enrollment in these in the physical sciences and engineering and computer science.
There's some nice work by Jackie Eccles and her students that documents that girls might just have more options. So because of these patterns that you're noting where girls are improving their performance in things like math classes and continuing to maintain high performance in the more humanities-oriented domains, they may have more options for majors. They may feel like, well, I could do this or I could do that, and maybe I don't have as many hurdles if I pursue a social science degree or a humanities degree or a life science degree.
Yeah, our colleague Gerhard has talked about that before. Do you have any comments to make on that, Gerhard? Well, maybe not. Oh,
Yeah, I have to reactivate myself.
okay.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true what Phil said, that these disparities in schooling have disappeared. There's parity, and girls take all the advanced math classes like the boys, and they get better grades in it because they do, and then they say, I don't want to do it, and there is this idea of being a good student, and girls are very susceptible to wanting to be a good student, to please the teachers, to please the parents. And then if you tell girls this is part of being a good student and getting in a good college, they understand that. But then, as you say, Kelly, then they turn around and say, well, is that really interesting to me or not? And what we observe a lot is the career outcomes expectation difference. So in all of the stuff that we have done, girls are higher on altruistic goals, like how important is it to improve
To help others
society.
and help the world. Yep.
Girls are more interested in that, and also girls are generally more social. Girls are more interested in working with others, and so I think they don't make that connection that could be made. I mean, there is an argument to be made that if you work in STEM, you can help humanity, and in a major way. Like if you develop a vaccine, for instance, it's not just being a doctor that cures one patient at a time, but it just so also engineering. I mean, you can make these cases, but there's this disconnect. So girls want, they're good at it, but then at some point it's not attractive. And what Jackie Eccles says, girls have these options because they're usually also good in language arts, which some boys maybe are not to that extent.
Exactly. I think the work that you're noting about those differences in occupational values, those highlights that maybe we should be putting our efforts towards interventions that bring attention to the fact that you can have a helping career as an engineer, that you can do pro-social work in computer science and engineering as well. Maybe that
absolutely.
messaging is where we need to go.
I totally agree. I think it's a framing issue. And Chen has done some comparisons over 10 years and how, I mean, these things, what you want out of your life, what you want out of your career is not necessarily biological, that you say, well, girls are just, or females are more caring in their nature. That could be socially conditioned. So Absolutely. It could change. And Chen found that there's a convergence in what young people want out of their careers at the college age. So it's the gender differences are shrinking. The one aspect or the one field where they're not shrinking is in science, where we try to get more girls in, but the girls are very different in science than the boys, because the boys don't care. They really do not care about the social effects of the science. They have other interests. So that's like one of the last domains where there's really a gender difference. And this is important for professors to know, I mean, to look at their students and to understand and realize that they want different things out of what's happening.
Yeah,
I'd say the adding the pictures to textbooks of female engineers and scientists, and also more diversity, people of color in these occupations, was supposed to have some effect, and it doesn't appear to have an effect. Now we look back at it and say, oh, well, that's pretty simplistic. But the attempts to change these things to make them better have not appeared to work. But Chen has done some research in this. So.
Yeah, what we found was it's interesting that in the past 10 years, for people who are interested in all kinds of jobs, in the past 10 years, they are getting more interested in helping people, right? No matter gender, like it can be a male who is interested in health work, or a female who is interested in business. Whatever gender you are, whatever career interested, you are getting more and more interested in helping people, and of course in earning more money. But there's only one exception, is that people who are interested in science. Is that and it applies to both male and female, that they are exactly where they were 10 years ago in terms of helping people. Right. So whereas everybody else are getting more interested in helping people, those who want to be, have a career in science, are about the same 10 years ago. So in comparison, they are become more uncommunal in this perspective. We have another interesting article that may be related to your work about the gender matching between science educator and the students or museum visitors. We looked at a national sample of students, and in particular, their gender match between their first high school teacher in physics, chemistry, and biology. And we did find among 3 subjects, there are 2 subjects we find a very similar pattern that you had in your graph. There is an interaction effect, meaning indicating a gender matching effect, but we did not find a gender matching in physics. So in physics, both gender of students had a boost in their physics identity if they had a male teacher, right? But for biology and for chemistry, and girls will have a more boost from female teacher, and boys will have a boost from male teacher. Yeah, I can send you that article.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm thinking about why you might not see it for physics. And I wonder if it's about physics being perceived, but chemistry is often perceived as challenging too. I was wondering if maybe the rates were kind of low across the board to start.
Yeah, because chemistry, if you look at college enrollment in chemistry major, it's nearly 50-50 already. And biology, we have more female for quite a while. In physics, is pretty stagnant, that there's more boys than girls in the past, almost forever. So our interpretation is that this gender matching need to reflect what is going on, what the representation looks like in the macro environment to really kick in, to have an effect.
We have a study we're doing right now where it's with high school kids in formal school settings across high school, 9th through 12th grade. And I haven't started coding the data yet, but we asked the kids towards the end of the survey to just name scientists who they've learned about in school. And thinking back on we started developing the coding system, and we're trying to code for the gender of the scientist, the ethnicity of the scientist, and then the field of study. And I don't think we have coded a single physicist so far in the early drafting of the system. So in general, they are citing, famous, well-known biologists, but it may also be just that they can't name or can't think of scientists who study physics, especially scientists who study physics who look like them. I have no idea. That's totally anecdotal right now. I have not really started coding the data yet, but I don't think there's any.
Yeah. Gerhard, that doesn't bode well for your book on Einstein.
This is true. I mean, I thought maybe one of them would remember Einstein as a physicist, but I can tell you that, I mean, I did a study in like late 80s, early 90s on professional scientists. So they were already old, or like in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, in the 80s. So very different generation. Marie Curie was prominent. I mean, that's prominent among the female scientists. There was one or two books about Marie Curie, and that came up. So it was fabulous how much they kind of honed in on that one specific role model, and it became so important. So for that old generation, really old generation, that was totally different. So
Absolutely.
if you had done your study like 50, 60 years ago, you would get a lot of physicists. I'm sure about Marie Curie from the girls, but I hope Einstein from the boys, although I don't know that.
I think the most common, and again, this is like really early looking at the data, but the most common name that I've seen so far is Bill Nye the Science Guy, for the scientists who they know and can name.
Right? Who isn't a scientist?
That's a regression.
Exactly.
That's really a regression.
I was wondering if there's any effect of watching female presenters in videos that similar to the ones you have with the informal science settings.
That's what I started to hint towards that. I'm hoping to design some Zoom-friendly studies now to look at that. So if you don't have the opportunity to have a female educator in your traditional school environment, then does joining, our local museum, the Natural Sciences Museum here in Raleigh, has been doing these Talk with a Scientist once a week for kids, and they are trying to create invite diverse scientists to give these talks. They're kid-friendly, they're geared towards middle and high school students, and
Right.
it's a ripe opportunity. I haven't had a chance to get on top of it yet, but I think it'd be fascinating to look at whether it would work.
Yeah, I think it would be. I mean, definitely. The question is, it's a good idea, and all of us in the video field are trying to promote this. I just put up a link for Molly Edwards. She did a whole series of videos that have really done very well, and she just did it on her own when she was a graduate student. And they're this sort of enthusiastic, encouraging, interesting, non-stereotypical, and that was her goal. And it's like it'd be wonderful if there's studies that show that this kind of thing works, because I'm totally in favor of it. So
In the high school programs at informal science centers, are they also meeting other people beyond their educators? Because I used to help run a teen internship, right? And I was the main educator, but every week they met new scientists from across the museum that were doing work. And have you looked at how that might play into their results and how they see themselves?
That's a great question. So it kind of shifts depending on the site. We have one site that I'm especially excited to look at that with. There is this one site that it's the center of the cell in London, and it is hung over top of one of the Queen Mary University cell biology labs. There's about 500 researchers who are working on the ground below this museum facility, and you can look down over these glass walkways and see them working. And at that site, and especially, they do try to bring in the scientists who are working downstairs on a regular basis to talk to the teens and to engage with them. But there is one of the things that we're interested in this project is looking to identify best practices in the long run for how to make these programs especially effective. And there is variation. So some of the kids in the programs are really only interacting with the staff at that site, and others are having these guest speakers and opportunities to interact with others from other sites. So we're going to need to do some nice multi-level modeling to account for site level differences and things like that. We have our program evaluator right now trying to put together a full white report that just basically establishes exactly what happens in these programs, what kind of training they receive, and what experiences they have beyond the kind of structured, this is what the program looks like details. I think those factors are going to matter quite a bit. Unfortunately, our sample size isn't huge, so it's going to be challenging to pull out those differences.
Hey, this is Ellen. Thanks for a really fun talk. It's fun to think about these constructs. I was wondering if your choices to look at only binary children, if just thinking ahead to, the manuscripts and the reviewers, and could you kind of speak to how you and your group are thinking about that in the current context?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So in our more recent studies, we have asked kids to identify their gender identity, and we're using the Child Trends Recommended Report for Adolescents, which allows you to identify both your gender at birth as well as your current gender identity. And in our sample of teens who are in the youth educator sites, they're all identifying as either male or female, and we don't have any kids who are participating currently who are indicating a difference between gender at birth and their current gender identity. So I simplified it for the purpose of these presentations and just gave you the male female. But in our high school data collection that we're doing right now, we do have, out of like 700 kids, there's maybe 10 who are indicating that they're somewhere not in the traditional male female spectrum. And we've been talking about, what do we do with those kids? Because there's not enough of them to really understand their experiences. We have been trying to be careful about not explicitly saying this is a girl, this is a boy in our measures that we're using, and instead just represent someone who looks traditionally female or someone who looks traditionally male. And we've also been moving away from the stereotype measures that ask for boys, girls, both boys and girls, and instead now we're using a 100-point VAS scale where they can select from masculine to feminine anywhere on that scale. So we're moving towards trying to capture this, but I don't think we're doing a great job of it yet. And I think I have one PhD student who's really interested in these questions, and she has been frustrated with having statistical tools to actually give her the ability to analyze these small samples of kids who are falling somewhere not in the male-female binary, what to do with them. Any thoughts you have would be wonderful, because I think it's a really important issue. We're trying, but I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, well, I think that, if we weren't sitting in a talk, right, and we were reading the manuscripts and you provided that context, I think that we'd be like, oh, okay, cool, in knowing that you and your team have thought about it. But in terms of, understanding a group that's small, I mean, I think some of the non-parametric techniques that are not too embraced by psychologists, sorry to diss my psych buddies, but hello, where have you been? The non-parametric techniques are fascinating. And I would actually use non-parametric techniques for a number of the measures that you all collected, given their, I can stand behind them as ordinal measures, but not maybe so much as interval measures. So,
Yeah.
sorry, I'm being nerdy. Let me come back to the point. The point is that maybe that could help you quantitatively, but maybe there are some more important qualitative kinds of, methods, or more important questions that could be answered with qualitative findings, and so I don't know, that's always something to explore.
Absolutely.
But thank you for bringing your work to the forum today. It's really fun.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, if the numbers are low, it's pretty hopeless quantitatively. But qualitatively, you can investigate it. And the way we've done it is you don't try to draw them from if you're looking at a particular group, you don't try to draw them from the general population. You go places, you try to identify places where there's a higher probability of having people in a particular group. If you go to, if you just go to the science museums and you take the kids who come through the door with their parents, you're going to have low numbers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's important to examine, though, and to continue thinking about how to do it. So in the high school data collection, where we have about 10 kids right now out of the 700 or so, we are doing qualitative interviews that I sent the consent forms out last week. And I have honestly no idea whether any of our kiddos who were not identifying as male or female are in that group who offered to be interviewed, nor do I know yet whether their parents gave consent. Maybe we'll have some qualitative data from those.
Yeah, the other thing is anonymity is probably pretty important when you're asking questions like that. And that's hard to do in the types of studies that you're carrying out.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, this has been fantastic. I mean, we usually get one study. To get 4 studies, my head is about to explode. So
Trying to
this-
give you
I've
a
been
taste of
thinking
different
about
things
this
we're
for a
working on.
while.
This is fascinating. Thank you so much, Katie, for sharing your
Absolutely.
work with us. And I hope we will keep in touch so we can keep communicating between our departments and our groups.
Thank you all so much for coming today and listening.
All right. Hey, terrific.
I will follow up with a YouTube link that we with the recording of your talk.